He was one of England's most notorious kings who would wield the axe to take off the heads of his closest friends, and even his wives. Henry VIII is remembered in history as a tyrant and a bloody ruler who would stop at nothing to get his own way, and he would bring a huge degree of change to his country. It's estimated that 70,000 people inside of his kingdom were executed on scaffolds all across England, in some of the most barbaric and brutal ways, including hanging, drawing and quartering, and even boiling alive. But despite being a tyrannical beast of a man, Henry VIII was greatly loved by his people, and when he died, there was a huge amount of sorrow across England, and a large amount of instability would come following his death. The king in his final days was a shadow of his former self, and he had put on a huge amount of weight, and his physical decline brought about his death sooner than it should have. But on the 28th of January 1547, the large and grotesque Henry VIII died inside of his palace, and he left a kingdom behind him which was incredibly different to when he inherited it. But King Henry VIII for certain made his mark upon history. Join us today as we look at the painful death of King Henry VIII, and as always, to support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. Henry VIII is remembered as being the king who had 6 wives, and his relationships and marriages were at times a joke. But he throughout his life did not live the most healthy lifestyle, and he did contract a number of serious and severe illnesses. When he was 23 years old, the king caught smallpox, which was a deadly disease which would for centuries cause chaos and a lot of suffering. But the king recovered from this, and 7 years later, when he was 30, he also caught malaria, which caused a number of other problems. But one of the king's most famous injuries and problems was caused by his decision to joust and take part in medieval tournaments. The king would love to show off, and he would take a leading part in these tournaments, and in particular on the tilt yard and in the jousting. When he was 33, he took part in a tournament which would cause him a huge amount of suffering for the rest of his life. He had a very infamous jousting accident which plagued him for years, and some historians even believe with this the king's personality changed and he became more morose and depressed, and also he was prone to mood swings. There is a correlation between this accident and the king's behaviour, and he became much more of a tyrant. Henry VIII, whilst he was jousting with possibly the Duke of Suffolk, was hit off his horse above the right eye by a wooden lance. This knocked the king off the horse, and the horse then fell on top of him. For over 2 hours the king was knocked out and he was unconscious. Historians have stated that he may have had a traumatic brain injury from this accident that caused his swift mood changes, and in the years after, Henry VIII had further health issues. His mobility caused a lot of problems, and the injury on the tilt yard also exacerbated a previous leg injury, and the king had an ulcer which became very sore. Henry VIII was now being carried around, and he may have even had diabetes and high blood pressure, as he piled on a huge amount of weight and had a waist measurement of 52 inches and a chest measurement of 53 inches. But all of these problems would lead to the king's health getting much worse, and at the age of 55 he passed away on the 28th of January 1547 inside of his bedchamber at the Palace of Whitehall. To those who served Henry VIII in his final days, it was clear that the king was very ill, and that the end was probably near. Henry saw his confessor the day before he died and received Holy Communion, but the doctors would be fearful to tell Henry VIII that he was dying. They were concerned that telling the king this would lead to a last-minute treason charge, with a royal doctor predicting the death of the king, and this was technically something that could result in someone losing their head. But it was the brave Sir Anthony Denny, a gentleman of the Privy Chamber, who took the bold step to tell Henry VIII what was coming, the day before he died, and he told the king that, in man's judgment you are not like to live, and he told the king to remember his sins as every good Christian man should do. Henry VIII with this knew he was dying, and he replied, "The mercy of Christ is able to pardon me all of my sins, yes, though they were greater than they be." With this reply, Henry VIII was acknowledging the sins he had committed throughout his life, and he said he knew that executing his wife's friends and many others possibly could prevent his ascent to heaven. As mentioned, around 3% of the population were executed by the laws of Henry VIII's kingdom, and even until his last days he was condemning high-ranking nobles, as he sent Henry Howard, the Earl of Surrey, to the beheading block on Tower Hill. But Henry VIII's last demand was that Thomas Cranmer, the Archbishop of Canterbury, would be summoned to be with him in his final moments. Denny got hold of Cranmer, and at the time the weather was very poor, which delayed Cranmer's journey by a few hours, and the frozen roads caused chaos, and he arrived just after midnight on the 28th of January. He went to the king's bedside, and Henry was barely conscious at this point, and he would only be able to respond by squeezing hands, and he could not really talk. It was said of these final moments that, at the end there was no master and servant, no prince and churchman, just a priest preparing a departing soul for eternity. Cranmer begged Henry to give him a sign that he trusted Christ for salvation, and in response he felt a grip on his hand tighten slightly. It was an evangelical departure, no anointing, no reading of Latin prayers, just a simple acknowledgement of the all-sufficient atoning work of Christ. Cranmer would be glad of that. At around 2 a.m, King Henry VIII died inside of his bedchamber in the Palace of Whitehall. The exact cause of Henry VIII's death is not known. There has been a lot of speculation around this. Many say he may have died from natural causes, others say pulmonary embolism or problems with his liver. But the king was a sorry state compared to what he was in his younger days, when he was considered one of the most handsome princes of Europe. But for the next 2 days after his death, Henry VIII's body was left resting in the chamber, and his death was kept a secret. His meals were brought to his rooms, but on the morning of the 31st of January, Lord Chancellor Risley made a statement to Parliament announcing Henry VIII's death. His son Edward VI was immediately proclaimed king. But the boy would be taken to the Tower of London to await his coronation. But Henry VIII's body remained in his chambers, and it was embalmed by the royal doctors. With this, the king's heart and organs, such as his bowels and liver, were removed from his body, and a large cut was made in the body to do this, and then the vital organs were placed in containers. Traditionally, these were buried elsewhere from the body, and the cavity of Henry VIII was then filled with herbs and spices to stave off decay. It was then encased in a lead coffin, and for the next few days the coffin lay in state in the presence chamber of Whitehall, and it was then moved to the chapel. But across the nation the bells of churches would toll and ring out for their deceased king. But around 2 weeks after his death, on the 14th of February 1547, the body of King Henry VIII made its way to its burial place inside of St George's Chapel in Windsor Castle. The huge coffin was covered in velvet and cloth of gold, and it was placed on a chariot which was drawn by black horses who took it along the roads, which had to be widened for the procession. On top of the coffin was a huge wax effigy of Henry VIII, who had a crown placed on his head, and also his clothes were covered in gems and precious stones. But the funeral procession rested in the evening at Sion Abbey, before it continued on to Windsor the next day. 16 strong yeomen of the guard were required to carry Henry VIII's huge coffin, and they carried it into St George's Chapel, then lowered it into the vault of the choir inside of the church. The king had been buried according to his wishes, next to his third wife Jane Seymour, who was the mother of Edward VI. Following the funeral, Henry's chief officers of the household broke their ceremonial staves of office, and they threw these into the vault, showing that their roles were over. But Henry VIII did not want to be laid to rest here forever. He planned for a huge tomb to be created for him, and the work for this would have seen it being the largest tomb ever made in England. It would have had a huge ornate decoration and detailing on it, as well as a lifelike effigy of Jane Seymour and Henry VIII. This would then have presumably been placed inside of Westminster Abbey, close to the tomb of his father, Henry VII. But this coffin was never finished, and because of this, Henry VIII still is laid to rest in his vault against his wishes, 500 years after his death. Buried alongside him is also King Charles I, the executed King of England who lost the English Civil War. King Henry VIII, without doubt, is one of the most notorious and brutal kings that England ever had, and he would be a man who would brutally slaughter and torture if he could not have his own way. But he was a very complex fellow, but he was a man who was loved by his people despite the chaos he brought, with his marriages and changes to their lives, with his reforms to the church. But his death was one which was a sharp contrast to his reign, as Henry VIII slipped away quietly, being attended on by the Archbishop of Canterbury, and the king in his final moments did acknowledge the suffering he had caused in his time on the throne. He was aware of his own brutality, and with this, his death brought a brand new dawn for England. Thanks for watching. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe, and once again, thank you so much for watching.